Kidden go hetren na jade fiel, loft it teverish, go gelen shed a part gorlegia, nach moran toishe, domin je jarnurio, elede frenyu, es a honya as. So you might be saying, why would you start a talk with a song like that? Well, basically because when Dodo said to me, you're going to be doing a talk about Cathal, the big thing was, where would you start? Where would you start? There's so many aspects to Cathal. So I was rummaging about and I thought, well, he always is a song man anyway, that's why we're here. So there's a song in it. He also was very much into the language, so there was also that in it. And then I was trying to think about other things, and it struck me that that little verse is such a very spiritual and open-hearted piece of poetry. And it's egalitarian, very much so, and it's also very contradictory in a way, that even though it's a very religious verse, it's commonly used as the introduction to a very ordinary, I love you, he loves me kind of love song. I don't know what it's doing at the beginning of the song, but it's always there. And the song's called Anya Yes, the Gil Well Done. And finally, if you, well, I'm not going to sing it again, you'll be glad to hear, but if you get to know it, at the end of the second line, it's just the way this tune is constructed. It's not like an Irish tune at all. It's got a real classical modulation to the dominant twang in the middle of it.
Oh,
I've just said that to show off. Don't always have the problem of knowing it's coming. Anyway, so anyway, I'm going to translate it now. Just what it actually translates as. It says, Columkill says that generous people do not go to hell. The money men deny their wealth to God. Isn't it a great disaster that anyone who has ever created should gather up so much stuff that it would block their way into heaven? It's a lovely verse. Anyway, but the word generous jumps out of that to me in Irish, feel. Because Cathal, whatever else he is one of the most generous people you could possibly meet. He was always quick to encourage, always quick to take part in things. He includes everybody in everything. And he shares his very, very many gifts, which I'll be going on about for some time. Not the least of his gifts is his wit. His sense of humour takes an awful lot of weird forms, and I'm not going to go over them all. I'm not going over them all, but one that always struck me as very interesting was a habit he developed about, it must have been 30 years ago, from some man called Cricket, I think he was a friend of Cathal's, who told lies and told them stories. And the whole point of the thing was to make up the most outlandish lie. Now, I'm not going to try to do it, but I do remember the name of one of them was wonderful. It was called the Belgian Racing Toe. What exactly that was, Cathal will maybe tell you later after a couple of glasses of wine. But anyway, he's also performed storytelling in various odd settings. I'll just tell you one particular instance. A couple of years ago, on a misty evening during a Halloween festival down in Tullamore Forest, just outside Newcastle, where we live, Cathal was standing on one of the stone bridges in Tullamore Forest, dressed in a cloak, with a big hat and a lovely stick, reciting Gaelic lays to anybody who happened to be passing by. My daughter and my 3-year-old grandson happened to be passing by. And little Leo, that was his name, was a bit scared by this vision on the bridge. But my daughter assured him not to be afraid, because the old guy was her uncle, Grandad's brother. So they got past, and when they got past a wee bit, Leo whispered to his mummy, "Mummy, does Grandad know his brother's a wizard?" Anyway, Cathal interest in reinterpreting Celtic tales eventually led to his publishing a volume not very long ago called Red Beach, which is a set of parallel texts of Irish and English stories, most of them from South Down, which are, full of Cathal's very idiosyncratic literary style and some daft jokes. There's a pretty unfortunate man, can I say this, Cathal? I hope you don't mind. He's got a bit called Joe Travis, who's got a butcher's shop in Uri. So one of the men who was involved, I think, in butchering that brown bull or wherever it was, Joe Travis's shop, I should have said, is called Joe's Quality Meats. So Carl christened the butcher in the town Joe Squality. Anyway, that was a particularly useless thing to do. He was a teacher for many years, and he has a lot of stories to tell about his pupils. There's a lot of Carl's connection here, so they'll be fed up with this story, but I think it's one of the best teacher stories I've ever heard. Carl was, in fact, a music teacher. And one day he was teaching the class the basics of the tin whistle. So he said something like, you don't blow into it, you breathe gently, and you use your tongue to organize the sound, and you put one finger out for a B, and another one for an A, and a G. Now, any questions? And a hand went up and he said, yes, John. Can you get the heads off a dead cat? Anyway, there you are. As a singer, Cathal can approach traditional matters with sometimes less than the expected level of deference. You'll not be surprised to hear. Jerry Anderson famously talked about the odd habit in folk music circles in Derry of everybody adopting a posture of silent deference when anybody sang anything or said anything in Irish. And Cathal, I'm sure, smiled when he heard Jerry Neal in that particular cultural straitjacket. Anyway, in one of the pieces which Donal has recorded, Cathal treats a very sombre tale of fairies and changelings to a weird, Spike Milligan-esque, maybe Miles and the Goblin-esque literal translation. And here's just a wee sample of it. I don't know if we're going to hear it. But anyway, here we start. It's called the Manus Ó Baoill, and it starts, Manus Ó Baoill, and she'd led and chatting, which translated in English means, I was going to Dublin on Monday. But Cathal renders that is, on my going to Hurdleford to me on the first day of the seventh sum. The next line goes, Hal Kalinogaram Adam More Chanji is you, which means I met a young girl I really liked. And he says, a young maid happened on me that I gave her great regard and pleasure. I'll not go on. That's enough of that. You get the idea. The great scholar Sean Corcoran once argued that songs that don't originate in places where you normally expect to find traditional songs should be considered as part of the tradition, as long as real traditional singers want to sing them. That was one of Sean's big things, and I'm sure he's right. Cathal has always acted on that principle. For in sessions or places where you'd be thinking of mostly folk songs, he might sing you something about Thomas Moore or Burl Ives or anybody like that. You wouldn't know what. Mind you, a lot of people are doing that nowadays, but I think it was disapproved of to a certain extent in the past. But one of Cathal's big songs is the Victorian Musical Hall song, which he manages to make sound as if it's a very Irish traditional song. It was only about a year ago. I've been listening to this for 70 years. It was only about a year ago I came across it in a book and realised, damn it, that's not a song at all. That's not a traditional song at all. It's called Billy Johnson's Ball, which, again, after a glass of wine or two, Cathal might sing for us tonight. It was written by an English composer called G.W. Hunt in the year 1870, and was sung by a celebrated English music hall artist called Frederick Coyne. And his picture hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. So what do you think of that? Anyway, Cathal is more than a musician and a humorist. Unlike the rest of the Carmel O Boyle, that's my family, not this lot. He always loved craft work, particularly anything with wood. So if you want a shelf or a cabinet put up, or famously in our family, a wall knocked down, or a Baroque music stand constructed, Cathal's your man for any of those things. When he finally retired from teaching as a music teacher after God knows how many years, he signed up as an apprentice joiner and spent a long time walking up and down roofs, naming things into things, which isn't bad at all for a member of my family, all of whom are scared of heights, including himself, as far as you know. Anyway, the thing he complained about most was not so much the heights as the fact that all the other workers on the site were very silent all the time, which must have been a real strain for such a natural communicator. Anyway, I better say something biographical. In brief, Cathal was born in Armagh, I think in 1941, is that right? Yeah. His third child and second son of Manus Ó Baoill of Belfast and Alice Woods of Fermanagh. His schooling was in Armagh, and after that he went to Belfast where he met Nora, his wife. And after a spell in the missions in Africa, they came home and settled down as teachers in South Down, where they have raised a large family of individuals as varied in talent and personality as themselves. They're all here. You'll notice that I mentioned Africa. In the early 60s, Cathal and Nora went as missionary teachers to Nigeria and returned within a year or two because of the outbreak of the Biafran War. During their time there, Cathal was in the habit of sending tapes home. Okay. Wait for it. One of these was a piece of music he composed for piano. Unfortunately, I lost it now. It was called, technically, it was called Anhiad Luan Izangwa, the first Monday in Zangwa. Zangwa being the name of the little town in which they were working in Africa at the time. It was a lovely piece. But I remember having a fight with Cathal about it because he claimed it was in B flat, whereas in fact it was in G minor. But that's and anyway, that's a very old fight. Never mind. Many of us will remember the great Brian Murphy from Fork Hill, and one of the big songs that Brian used to sing was "The Green Linnet." And it's just in case you don't know anything about it, it's a spectacular Napoleonic song, in which the singer goes and meets Ireland, I think a young lady on the Rhine, weeping for the death of the great emperor. Yeah. Cathal also sang this song quite a bit. But when he went to Nigeria, he sent it home on one of his tapes, but he had put his own wee spin on it. So he started it off, "Curiosity led a young native of Ireland to view the sweet banks of the Niger." Anyway, but the tape, which was most talked about in our family, at least by me, has the following story. At home we had a big old-fashioned Farraghraph tape recorder, big little thing, which could not play the smaller reels that were then becoming useful at the time, were coming into use. And it was one of these smaller machines that Cathal was making his recordings in Nigeria and sending them home. So when the first of them arrived in the post, my father went to a colleague of his to borrow a more up-to-date machine. I say colleague, that is to say they both taught in the same school, but there was always a frostiness between these two men. Anyway, Daddy went up and explained what he wanted to this man, whose peculiar personality is summed up in the nickname he got in school, which was Johnny Knock. So Daddy approached. Anyway, as luck would have it, his colleague happened to be in a hurry out, so he simply showed Daddy how to work the machine. And Daddy brought the thing home, and we all sat around to listen. And he switched it on, and Cathal's voice went, "I know your old Farraghraph can't play this size of a reel, Dad, but just go on up to that wee knackered Johnny Nark and ask him." I can't be sure my father ever recovered from that, but anyway. That was a memorable day. My father had worked for the BBC as a young man, and he had a collection of 78 RPM records from the BBC. And when he died, most of these ended up with Cathal. Don't know why, but they did. Anyway, many of Cathal's songs were learned from those old records, and when Tommy and Donald began to set up this archive, Cathal was more than happy to donate the lot, and they're still here. And among other things on those things, there's a few songs by my grandfather, I think, also Cathal O Boyle. But anyway, he also gave his time, Cathal also gave his time in many, many other ways over the years, in politics, for one thing. In the early days of the Troubles, Cathal was very active in the civil rights movement, and he made a particular mark during a dispute about the requirements of the census. On refusing to make a return, he ended up in Crumlin for a month, which was interesting. He later became a local councillor in South Down, having stood for the election only after receiving the assurance from the party that he couldn't possibly win. So he won. And he started the single term on what is it, Newry Moor Council, Downey District, whatever it was. Anyway, possibly as a function of his deep religious conviction, in politics his impulse was always towards peace and reconciliation more than anything to do with a particular party. For years, Cathal was on the wing of the Catholic community that cultivated ecumenical relationships at both local and more general level. And if he isn't a theologian exactly, he certainly read more theology than any normal sane Christian. Anyway, interestingly though, he had a party-oriented socialist leaning. Sorry, even though he had no party-oriented socialist leanings, he did align himself, at least musically, with the Workers' Party on the famous occasion in the 1980s when he played the clarinet in what came to be known as the Sticky Band, better known as the Flower Band. That was down the road in many happy days marching around the Global Jews. Cathal and Nora, between them, set up another band which for quite a few years entertained the people of Newcastle in the run-up to Christmas as it raised money for charity. This was a thrown together bunch of singers and musicians led by Cathal on saxophone, which, because its dimensions fluctuated greatly, he christened the Elastic Band. People in Newcastle remember it, and it's passing very much. In Newcastle and the area around, Cathal is celebrated as a character in the best possible sense. For a long time he was known as the boy who walks around with his head in a book all the time. People wondered why he didn't bump into things. More recently, he's become known as the boy who wears sandals without socks in all weathers all year round. You might say, a barefoot man for all seasons. And he is a man for all seasons. Shanahy, Scaly, C, Dree of his Commodore Choy. A teacher, a wit, musician, linguist, scholar, for many years a sailor, joiner, philosopher, Camino walker, heart maker, politico, counsellor, the other one, both guys a counsellor, a family man, and a fast friend. I'll finish with that apart from one wee thing. If anybody asks, what was Manus' speech about? You can use Cathal's favourite response to questions about sermons. When asked what the priest had to say, Cathal would put an expressively dry face and reply, I don't know, he didn't say.